Guys, but so happy about our guest today and our topic today. I think it's very timely. I think it's going to be very helpful for all of us. And our guest has lived through something that's quite traumatic for any organization. Hopefully, none of us have to go through what she experienced, but I think all of us can learn from what she experienced. And we're going to talk about leading through organizational change. So if that's what you're looking for, you're in the right place. We have Dr. Diana Hindle here, who's written a memoir about it. And I think a lot of things that she shares will help us to get through this pandemic and beyond. So, Dr. Hindle, I want to welcome you to the show.
Hey, it's great to be here. Thank you. Honored.
Excellent. And many of you who've watched the show before, you may know my co-host. This is Miss Noelle Kohles. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rollis. Happy to be here as well.
Awesome. So hopefully we're actually live now.
We are.
Hoping for the best.
Got the message.
Okay, great. Okay, that's wonderful. Yes. Okay, because it took 4 times, I feel like I have to do this right here at least, It's just, we're so happy. We're so happy we're on. Okay, so let's get right into this. Since we're a little bit behind schedule here, we need to get right into the meat of this thing. Dr. Hindle, as you look at the events that we are going through right now with the pandemic and, the surge is just getting out of control. Last time I checked was something like 140,000 cases a day. That I would say that probably is in the realm of traumatic. Would you agree?
Oh yeah, wouldn't disagree at all. We've really moved from stress to trauma. And for all the folks in healthcare, that we've already been in an industry that is extraordinarily resilient. We're very gritty. We've practically seen it all as healthcare providers. But the COVID pandemic really stretches everyday routine workplace stress well into trauma territory. We're dealing with death and destruction, severe disruption, really on a scale that we haven't seen, or the threat of it. In many cases, if someone's not in the hot spot, there's certainly the threat of becoming the hot spot. So without a doubt, we've moved into trauma territory. Yeah.
And with that in mind, what are you suggesting are the top things that we should be thinking about if we're in leadership to be able to help our team get through this just a little bit better?
Yeah, well, certainly the things that help us become more resilient and cope are important. So we can't forget those things. And we need to attend to the individual as well. So ensuring that we have employee assistant programs, access to psychological counseling, access to peer and one-to-one support groups is really important. And as leaders, though, it's important for us to speak to the stigma that can exist around traumatic stress and particularly PTSD. As I said, we're a hardy lot and we're a stiff upper lip kind of culture. We're accustomed to adversity and trauma, but it's usually other people's trauma. And so it's really important that we're addressing the individual needs. But even more than that, we need to address the impact that trauma has on the culture of an organization. And there's been a lot that's written about how trauma affects individuals and what to do about it, but there's really been very little published about how trauma affects organizations as a whole. And so that's something that I think leaders becoming really attuned to and thinking about things that they can put in place to both improve survival, but also allow an organization to thrive. And in my experience, and in going through significant workplace trauma, that's exactly what we did. We not only were able to survive a horrific trauma, but we thrived in the aftermath. And so that's really the distinction that I think collectively now we're experiencing.
Diana, thank you so much for sharing that. What were the defining moments towards the end of that trauma that allowed you guys to thrive and come out of it?
Well, we experienced a workplace shooting. And for those who don't know the backstory, a man came to the hospital lobby one day. It was actually April 16th, 2009. And I say the date because very much like people who experience trauma, they think of the before time and the after time. And so they often remember a date. And similarly, the experience we're having with COVID, we think of the before times and now the after times. And what we experienced when that man came to the hospital lobby, he entered the outpatient pharmacy. He shot and killed the supervisor of the pharmacy. But then he traveled through the rest of the hospital, through the hallways, and exited the building He then encountered another man who was the executive director of the pharmacy department, and he shot and killed him as well. He then turned the gun on himself and killed himself. What was defining, of course, and what was shocking is that alone would be shocking, but the man who was the shooter was an employee. He was one of our own, and he had come to work and he had shot his two bosses. So that reverberated through the organization. One of our very own had done something that was just unconscionable, that none of us could have ever imagined. That particular employee was beloved. So it was very confusing for us to understand how and why it had happened. He had been honored as the employee of the month just the month before.
Wow.
So it reverberated through the organization in ways that had long reach. And certainly any kind of trauma like that would impact the organization. But, initially we bonded together, of course, in the immediate moments, the camaraderie, that sense, kind of like after 9/11, when something really bad happens, we come together. But because we didn't have a common enemy, because he was an insider, it created a lot of division within. The question of why, the motive, what made him do it, who should have known, how come we didn't prevent it? That really unleashed some patterns that later, now 11 years later, and with a lot more experience and working with other organizations, a number of patterns emerged that are fairly common in organizations when trauma happens. So initially, Noelle, your question about what initially happened, that bonding initially happened, our rallying together.
Right.
But then the question of why created the potential for division. So.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. What an incredible story. And I think what resonates the most and how does one come over it is the fact that it was somebody who you least expected it to be. And that really speaks volumes to where we are at now with the pandemic and leadership, because it's not so much what you teach leaders to do and recognize with employees, but how do you recognize that with your own peers? So thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Let me ask you a question. So did you think that the fact that the employee was beloved and someone you knew, do you feel that made it that much worse? Was it harder to get over because of that? I mean, how did that affect because it's already bad of itself, but I'm curious as to how did that affect things?
Well, it added to the complexity. It added to the complication because there were, this is an organization of more than 6,000 employees, more than 2,000 physicians. So probably 10,000 people who called this place home. It was really a city within a city. It never closes. And so the idea that it was someone from within who then we couldn't rally around an outsider. And people question their own judgment. Some people had been very close to the shooter, knew him well. And so they questioned their own judgment and had feelings naturally, understandably, traumatic feelings of guilt. Did they miss a sign? Should they have seen it coming? All those kinds of questions that from far removed, of course, we'd say, well, of course, they needn't feel guilty. But when you experience trauma as an individual, those are the things that commonly surface. So there was a wide range of guilt. There were people who were further removed and who, of course, knew the victims very well, one of whom was a very close friend of mine and I'd known for more than 20 years. And so there were different opinions about the shooter, what had caused it, what had led to it. It was really astounding to see how quickly his action turned into our own questioning of ourselves. And so a wide cast of secondary blame, if you will. And that was a phenomenon that I wouldn't have expected. And yet I see very commonly happen. And so from a trauma perspective, it is expected. But to your point about this being an insider, it added to the shock value. I, for one, was a responder to all three scenes. And as the event unfolded, in my wildest dreams, I would not have thought that person was the shooter. It had never dawned on me. And in fact, it had been reported to me that he had run out of the lobby. That particular person had run out of the lobby, and I was afraid for him. I thought he was chasing the shooter.
Oh, wow.
And when it was revealed that he was the shooter,
wow,
it was such a overwhelming shock and surprise.
Right.
So it was that kind of,
And you look at emergency preparedness, what we go through in hospitals and what we learn. What would be one message that you could share with us, knowing the knowledge that you have? Because when we're prepared for emergencies and situations like these, you're right. It's from the outsider in. It's not from the insider out. And I think subtle clues may be helpful in recognizing it, but it's also a fine line, I would think. And correct me if I'm wrong, with you don't want to over dramatize. Oh, I'm seeing this and this and this with this person. They're going to go this way versus that, because it's not always going to be that case. But it's also important to be aware.
Sure.
And what does awareness look like?
Yeah.
Situation like that.
It really created a lot of complication because we did go through a process, of course, of evaluating our own assessment processes. For this particular situation, he wouldn't have risen to anyone's awareness. His motive turned out to be completely inconclusive. We were left never knowing why. Every possible motive was ruled out, and we were just left with the possibility that perhaps he'd been angry about a forthcoming or just recently passed layoff. That was just all we were left with. And so what it did allow us to do is realize that our rapid response training, our incident command, we'd never taken it for granted, but we'd always assembled ready to be taken care of people coming in from the outside. We gained new appreciation for how valuable that process was, how the ability to have a structured, disciplined response allowed us to steady our emotions. It gave us, it decreased the amount of confusion and chaos. And without a doubt, there was a ton of confusion and chaos, but it reduced it. It steadied our emotions. It allowed us to fall into routine, which really helped in the, immediate aftermath. But to the question of how to predict, I think we were left with the true knowledge that in many times, it is very difficult and hard to predict. What is important is to make sure that resources for mental health are very available to everyone, and that a constant focus on that and attention to that, and taking every complaint or concern seriously. In this case, we hadn't disregarded that, but it just reinforced the need for us to do that. So
it seems that, as I look at the similarities between what we're experiencing now and what you experienced back then, is that in both cases, we didn't know it was coming for the most part. Most of us didn't know this pandemic was coming. I mean, November, December 2019, I didn't even know what COVID, I wouldn't even know what that meant. So similar in your case, there's no way you could have foreseen this, because this was it wasn't like there were death threats or something earlier or some other things leading up to it. But I think where there's a difference is that pandemic is a long event. It's like, it seems like it never ends. Whereas what you're talking about, the event itself happened, sounds like relatively quickly.
Yeah, in both cases, certainly in both cases, a complete surprise, didn't see it coming. What I did learn when trauma happens, whether it's a single event that is overwhelmingly shocking or something that is chronic and rolling out and unfolding, both have long reach, so that the shock may be over, but the impact reverberated for years and years and years. I had the sense initially that, okay, it's over. And what I realized and learned that phrase, "it's over," was really premature. It took a long time for it to truly be over. So there are those similarities, whether they're an immediate event, a shocking, tragic event, or an unfolding tragic event. What's also similar in both is that while we're all experiencing the same trauma, we're all experiencing it differently. it's impacting us differently. Our perspectives are different about it.
Yes.
So there's a wide range of beliefs about what's happening and why. Some people are immediately affected in their workplace or with their families, or they themselves have gotten COVID, or they know someone who has gotten it or died. Others have suffered from the financial impact. So there's a wide range of points of view about it. And that's very similar to all the traumas that I've studied or consulted in since the trauma that I was involved in.
Well, I want to recognize some folks who have already come in today. We welcome to Patty Witt. Hello, good to have you. And Joe actually had a comment, which I think I'd like for you to comment on this. She says, I feel because this employee was a beloved employee that no one could understand the reason for it, and therefore they never got any closure. You think that was a big factor too?
That was a big factor. What was interesting, we all do create our own narratives when something happens. We all create our own stories depending upon what our experience was with the trauma.
Yes.
And so those stories remained with us. And without having a definitive answer, in some ways, it helped to stop any finger pointing or blame because it was inconclusive. So in some ways, for example, the motive that I held on to, the narrative that most affected me, was that it had been rumored that he was angry about an upcoming or past layoff. And of course, as the CEO, I struggled with that.
Yes.
So others had different narratives, of course, around other kinds of motives. But for me, that was really predominant and really haunted me for a lot of years. Not having closure just left that. On the one hand, it stopped the finger pointing, but on the other hand, we just silently did our self finger pointing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that was a difficult part, not having closure.
Those in the audience, I would like you to let us know, have you experienced a certain level of trauma in the past related to your workplace? And perhaps we can kind of explore that a little bit. And then also, how has the pandemic most affected you? I would love to see that in the comments, and that way we can perhaps use that as a topic as for part of our discussion. What's probably the single best piece of advice that you would give after experiencing what you've experienced during this time for the individual themselves? Not as much the leader, but the individual.
Well, for the individual to absolutely get help. And especially if you hear yourself saying, oh, I'm fine. I think fine often is code for perhaps not. And so to make sure that the trauma gets processed. I think we're all really good at developing coping mechanisms and developing ways of building resilience. But I think a trauma has to be processed. And often it has to be processed with a trained individual, or at least a support group of people at the very least.
Yes.
So I think getting help and talking through it is really important. Sometimes we think that if we talk about it, it'll, kind of embed it or reinforce it. I think the opposite's true. I think that helps us process it.
Okay.
You bring up such a great point about getting help, because what does that look like to an individual? Yeah. How do they get that? We, organizations offer employee assistance program, and you can hand somebody a pamphlet or discuss it, but oftentimes they're not going to go for it. So what do we do to allow them to know that it's there? I almost feel like it should be a part of reach out. You're not going to talk about it, but let me know if you need anything, how that goes. How do you work with that? Because oftentimes people don't get that help that they know may be an issue that they need.
Yeah, you raised such a great point, Noelle. I saw it time and time again. One, because we're tough.
Right.
For me personally, I'd faced a lot of adversity. I felt like I was tough. I was busy. And it was hard for me to admit that I had PTSD. And in fact, that ended up ending my career as I'd known it. After 6 years in the organization, I ended up needing to step aside. I had to recognize that I had PTSD, and the organization deserved a healthy CEO, and I deserved to recover. But to your point about how to continue to reach out, I think it's partly, and it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is because I wanted to come out as somebody who, as a leader, who had experienced trauma and had PTSD. I wanted to be able to be vulnerable and talk about that, and hope that that would encourage people who, as they're going through trauma, to also seek help, that to destigmatize it. I also learned what it was like to be a vulnerable patient, and that really informed my leadership practices tremendously.
Absolutely.
So it is about reaching out. It's destigmatizing. It's modeling it as leaders. It's being respectful of people's feelings and boundaries, not pestering them to join a support group or to get help, but for those who are getting help, to model it if they can, especially leaders, to speak to it. And sometimes leaders and individuals have a tough time for a lot of reasons modeling it. So that's one of the reasons I'm speaking out about it. As a former hospital CEO, as a healthcare professional, it's one of the reasons, because I can then speak out, be vulnerable about it.
I love that point you said, where you said that you felt it was time to step aside because the organization deserves a healthy CEO, but you also deserve to get well. So I want to give you this. I applaud you for that.
Thank you.
That was big.
It was it was the second hardest day of my life, frankly, because my identity was wrapped up in an organization that I had belonged to for 27 years.
Wow.
So my sense of purpose and being and belonging, my calling was in the work that I was doing. And so stepping aside was, it was the second sort of traumatic experience, albeit on a different scale, and something that I could reinvent myself, very different than being physically injured.
I have a follow-up question, but I want to make sure I recognize some of the folks who are commenting here, and I want to welcome them in. So welcome in. We have Audrey Burr. Good to see you, Audrey. She's in from Nebraska. And we have Marion Spears Carr. Yes, we were actually speaking at a conference today, and he was before me. I didn't get a chance to see it, but I definitely would like to see it. But thank you. Welcome. He says, outstanding stuff here. Thank you for sharing. So he appreciates you, Dr. Hindle. Thank you for what you're doing. So I wanted to ask you this, though. What was the trigger or the moment that you knew, I got to step aside. This is too much. The only answer is for me to step aside. What give me an idea, if you don't mind. Where was there a trigger? Like what led you to that point?
Well, over 6 years of time, there were constant triggers, visual, sensory, physical triggers. I was still working in the same place where the shootings had happened. There were 3 scenes. There wasn't a way to walk through the hospital without re-experiencing that. Sometimes I would walk through the hospital lobby and I'd congratulate myself as I got to the other side, like, oh, I didn't think of the shooting. And of course, then realize that I've just been thinking of the shooting.
Right.
So I think the constant, staying immersed in the same environment was really quite difficult for me. And I realized that I had all the coping, all the resilience. I'd done it all. I'd tried everything. I had gotten help. And it was just really clear to me that it wasn't healthy for me to stay in the same environment, that I did need to fully recover and give myself time to step aside. And for those in the healthcare world, you'll know the term assisted fall to the floor. So when a patient is a fall risk and they start to fall, we have a mechanism, a way of helping them, assisting them on the floor in a way that hopefully doesn't injure them and hopefully doesn't injure the caregiver. And in a way, I don't really say it was a choice or a decision. In a way, I had an assisted fall to the floor. And those around me, really reflected back to me that my options were to get help and get more help, more intensive help, and recover.
Yes.
And I also felt strongly that we had rebounded as an organization. We built a new team. We were stronger than we'd ever been before. We'd reinvented our decision-making processes and our team building. And I knew that team would carry on. And so I knew it was time. There were lots of signs and and that was ultimately it. It wasn't any one thing. It was quite a few things that happened.
So sometimes and a change happens. It's not something we necessarily want, but in the end, there's a lot of benefits that come from it. So as you look back at the 2020 version of Dr. Hindle versus the 2009 version of Dr. Hindle, what are some differences?
Well, without a doubt, that trauma changed my life. It changed how I led. It changed my perspectives. It focused my energies around meaning and purpose and bonding and do-gooding. So on the plus sides, there were, it really reinvigorated my calling. As I look back now, I'm glad to have reemerged and fully recovered, and glad to be doing work that is still making a difference and taking all that experience, both the day in and day out healthcare experience, but also the experience in leading through that trauma, and putting it to good use, being available to help others. And I've written a second book that's coming out with a co-author, coming out December 1st, around for frontline healthcare workers, specifically dealing with COVID and traumatic stress. And so it's being released December 1st by HarperCollins. It's called Why Cope When You Can Heal. And then I have a third book that is being released by HarperCollins, hopefully February, and it's leading through trauma.
Wow.
And how to turn trauma into triumph. So how to put systems and processes in place to not only survive disruption or traumas that happen in workplace, but also thrive, because that has been my experience, both personally, but also what I've observed in other organizations, that they can navigate them in a way that allows them to heal, but also galvanize and transform in really positive ways.
So I have a question for you. This is the same question I asked Mr. Quint Studer. I know you're going to be with him next week. If you had a choice, and folks in the comments, I want you to answer the question. I know what some of you are going to say, because I've asked, some of them have heard me ask this before. If you had the ability to do one of these two things, would you rather be able to see 10 years into the future for yourself only, or 1 year into the future for everyone else, but not yourself?
Oh, one year for everyone.
Why is that?
1 year for it. Well, I think if we can see what we're capable of as a species, as a community, as a nation, as even regional communities, I think our ability to come together and accomplish things that we can't even imagine. And so I would absolutely trade being able to see what we can accomplish as a collective versus anything as an individual.
What an awesome answer. I love that.
Yes, the great leader, Dr. Hindle, is here. I love it. Okay, one other question for you. What advice would you give to the 15-year-old version of Dr. Hindle? Well, let's just say Diana, because you're not a doctor.
Diana,
You're not a doctor at that point, so.
Yeah, I'm Diana all the way anyway.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, advice 15. Enjoy every minute. Really rejoice in the gift of being alive. Rejoice in the connections with other people. Really feel that connection and love at every moment. It feeds us. And so I would say rejoice. Worry less, rejoice more.
I love that. Rejoice. And even the darkest of circumstances, if we really look, would you agree we can find some joy?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, it is often the tale of two extremes. The worst moment also reveals some of the most astounding, profound moments as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What can you think of a time in the past, decade or so, where it seemed like it was not good at all, but something really joyful came out of it. Anything in particular stand out?
Gosh, that's a good question. I think I can think of lots and lots of times where we've thought things are worse than they are. And on the one hand, if we view things really clear-eyed and objectively and are unwilling to settle, then I certainly, think that's really important. I think sometimes we don't also see how far we've come, and that it's really a both and, that our ability to not settle and still look forward, but also celebrate who and what we are. And I really have moved into and have for a long time both and thinking, and that both can exist at the same time. We don't have to trade one for the other.
Yes. Oh, you know what? You just hit on something. And this is something that Candy and Beth taught me. Candy Campbell and Beth Boynton.
Yeah.
And you've heard of them? You know them?
I
think so.
I think I thought you'd mentioned them, but.
Okay, so one of the things they taught me was, a lot of times when someone brings a concept up to you, we'll say yes, but, like whatever the idea is. Yes, that sounds like a great idea, but how are we going to do this? Or but how are we going to do that, right? So they taught me to just change one word, which is yes and. And you said both and just now, and it just perked up my memory, because you seem to already have that type of personality. It's like, I'm accepting of that, and also this instead of but. I love that.
Yes. Yeah. And is a powerful word.
I love it.
Really powerful. Powerful globally, but really powerful as a leadership perspective, that it is and. I think of sometimes when we apologize, we'll say, I'm sorry I did that, but. Which really sort of
kind of negates it.
Instead, I'm
everything
sorry.
before it is negated.
Yes, but that, I think but can
it
really
destroys it. Your apology is gone at that point.
Yeah. So we probably use too much in our language, I think. I using it too much. So we need to cut the buts out and add more ands.
More ands.
Yeah. So we got quite a few comments here. All right. So by the way, Joe, before Patty Witt's comment here that I'm about to read, I don't see anything else because I had to do refresh. I wasn't able to see everything. But she says, I can't recall experiencing a trauma at work. All my trauma has been personal, not professional. Okay, thank you for that. And she said, I have had to do an assisted fall with a very large man. Not fun. And Christy Diggins, welcome. Christy Diggins Mancini. Excellent topics in these times. Well, thank you for your feedback. And Dr. Ferris Stevenson says, I have worked within an organization that has experienced this type of trauma. A grieving family member blamed and killed his wife's provider. He took lives of visitors and staff as he made his way to the provider. It took about 2 to 3 years for the staff to feel safe in the workplace environment. Before we move on, did you want to speak to that at all?
Without a doubt, when something like that happens, the imprint that's left on individuals in the organization is hard to even comprehend how re-triggering, re-traumatizing it can be. So I can well imagine that it takes several years to recover.
Yeah. So as we take that and apply that to our current life, you've already agreed earlier that if the trauma is similar, it's a different, but it's still similar in some cases. Do you feel it's going to take us 2 to 3 years to get over this? What do you feel?
I think it's going to be a process. I think it'll be different for everybody, again, depending upon how directly or indirectly they were affected, or their experience in it. So I think it will be different, and I think we'll need to be sensitive to that some people will process really quickly. Others, it will take time to process. So I think we'll need to be sensitive to that. And I do imagine we'll need to really unpack a lot of the feelings that have emerged and in order to heal from the trauma that we're collectively experiencing.
Yeah.
So, and largely around how divisive it can be, how sides can be taken, how finger pointing can occur. and how damaging that can be. It's when I say natural, it's what I really mean by that is it's expected, I guess. And in my experience, that's what I've seen happen. So I think it's important for leaders and all of us to see that that's possible or very likely, that division is very likely. And so for us to do everything possible to not sow the seeds of division, to do everything possible to unify.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, unity is definitely a key today. Christy says 1 year for all. So she agreed with you, Dr. Hindle. She would do the 1 year for all. Noelle, what would you say?
As you were talking, Diana, I was thinking
I'm
about
getting an echo.
You get an echo?
Oh,
yeah, a lot of echo.
Okay, let's see if we can fix that. 1 second.
Okay. Yeah, all of a sudden it just happened.
Let's see, one other thing here. Okay, go ahead. Oh, now I lost your sound.
Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
Oh, there.
Okay.
That's better.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. When we look at trauma in the workplace, what has your experience been with debriefing? And have you had phased debriefs happen over time when I look at situations that you've been through? And I ask that because you brought up a great point of people experience trauma at different times. And there's been times that in my healthcare experience, especially working in a pediatric critical care environment and as a leader, when we experience trauma, months can go by and you'll see the impact on a staff member later on. And often you get, why is she still talking about that now? Where some have gotten over that. So what has your experience been with debriefing? And do you feel that it's benefited in the beginning, but also having that phased approach with debriefs as well?
Completely agree. And I think this is another case of both and. So I think the debrief is really important. I think healthcare organizations tend to, because they have rapid response teams or incident command, they tend to do debriefs or after action reviews. Other industries, it's not been my experience. I've seen very much of an after action review or debriefing. There's sort of this culture of, we just look forward, we just go forward. What's happened is in the past, we don't need to unpack that again. But there's so much, of course, those of us in healthcare know we can learn by debriefing. Of course, when it's an internal trauma, making sure that it's psychologically safe, making sure that we're really clear we're not finger pointing or blame throwing. Healthcare organizations are pretty good about that because we've had a lot more practice with it. But you raise such a good point that it has to be a both and, in my experience, that doing one immediately so that you have the facts readily available, but then having a placeholder for additional touch points, recognizing that it very likely will reemerge again, and there will be some new things that emerge. And so we don't want to lose sight of that as well. So I think it's both. I'm glad you raised that because in the work I do with organizations outside of healthcare, I help them both to establish a rapid response team process, but also to embed that after action review process as well.
What was the key reason why you felt like, because you have a memoir that you wrote and there's lots of lessons to be learned, what made you feel like that, you know what, I do need to make another book that's especially for the COVID and leading through that? Give us your inspiration as to why you felt like that was necessary and what are some of the differences or nuances between it and your first book?
Yeah, well, when I set out to write a book, I initially was thinking of writing a leadership book around leading through trauma. But as I started writing, I realized that it needed to be a memoir. I wanted it to partly serve as a tribute to my colleagues, both that had died that day, but also the coworkers that I'd worked with for the next 6 years. I wanted to address individual and organizational trauma from a personal perspective. I wanted to come out as a CEO personally experiencing it and not having not writing it didactically or from a distance. I wanted to address the impact of PTSD. I wanted to serve in that way. So it became really clear it needed to be a memoir. What was also interesting at the time that I started writing it, that I envisioned that if I wrote a book about leading through trauma, there might be a little interest in it in the business community, but I think most people would say, well, we probably aren't going to have a shooting, or that's such a rare, or that's a unicorn, or a zebra event. And but what emerged as I published it this last March, of course, then COVID happened, and we started to see the traumatic impact of it. And so I was approached by HarperCollins and Mark Golston, Dr. Mark Golston, who wrote a great book called Just Listen. And he and I had gotten to know each other. And so we co-authored the book, Why Cope When You Can Heal, for frontline healthcare workers in COVID. Because I saw there were so many similarities, of course, not just the healthcare aspects, but the traumatic stress part. And then similarly, the actual business book of Leading Through Trauma now has become so much, there's so much more awareness about trauma in a workplace. And so people don't scratch their heads and say, well, I can't really see how that happened. One, they see the parallels, even though the shooting was an extreme example. They see the parallels because they've experienced COVID. But it also has uncovered that, frankly, they've been through a lot of workplace trauma that maybe they didn't label trauma. They'd been through traumatic events that they might have called scandals or a crisis. And I started to liken trauma in an organization to something that didn't go away after a media cycle. It had long legs. A crisis or a scandal, you did just get over and move past once you put in your processes for addressing it. But trauma had a lot more very long legs, a long reach. So things like sexual harassment, especially internally, systemic racism, acts of violence, of course, layoffs or threats of layoffs. I think if we are really honest, layoffs or threats of layoffs is something that frankly traumatizes almost all organizations. It has for a lot of years. And we've been dealing with the impact of that traumatic stress and not really called it that for a long time. So.
And you're right, we need to stop labeling PTSD as just another word that we casually use. And I feel literally the entire world understands what PTSD really means now and the effects of it. Because you're right, everyone has handled it in different ways, but we do need to stop labeling that word as just another word that we use in our vocabulary.
Yeah, that's such a great point, Noelle. As I was struggling with PTSD, and people would sort of casually use it, someone cut them off in the car and they have PTSD. When he was just sort of casually using that, I remember at the time thinking, boy, gosh, in some ways we use it so casually. But if I come out, and this is 10 years ago, and say, gee, I'm the CEO and I have PTSD, that would have been like, oh, wait a minute. I mean, that's a real diagnosis. We can use it casually, but you can't use it as to claim it as a diagnosis. So a lot's changed, I think, to your point. One, perhaps we won't use it as casually, but two, it becomes destigmatized as well.
One of the things that you said struck me a little bit is you didn't want to write a book from, or some of the books are out there are kind of more of a didactic kind of, they're separated from the subject. They're doing research and they're talking about it, but it's another thing to experience it personally, because we feel somewhat removed if we haven't experienced it personally. And I thought about instantly as you said that when I read Dr. Stevenson's comment. I read it, I'm on this show, I'm reading the comment, I'm making sure you're hearing it, but I wasn't mentally processing it. It took until just a couple of seconds ago for me to mentally process what she said she went through. So I don't know, something you said, all those things went through my head as we're doing the show live. It's like, wow. So Dr. Stevenson, I just want to say to you, I'm sorry you went through that. And my heart goes out to you. You worked at a place where a medical provider was killed and other people were killed. It's just a sad situation. So Anyway, sometimes we just go through something, we read something, we don't fully like process it, I think. So if I've read about PTSD before, but I didn't really know anyone who said that I went through it. And you're right. I've used it in the past at times, not because I was being, unfeeling, but it's just something I just did. It's like I got PTSD from this thing, because so I think that you're right, that we'll look at that term more seriously, and maybe after we experience this show together, that we'll have that much more empathy towards others and to ourselves for going through it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So thank you for this. This has been great. So I have a question for you. This is something that I think this is on people's minds a lot right now. Is I go to work, I can get the COVID, especially if I'm going to be in healthcare, and I may give this to my family. But then they also don't want to let their team down, right? Which is the people who they work with. I think that can be almost traumatic. It's like making a choice of like, what do I do? Do I go to work, possibly get the COVID, and then I'm out here in the public? Sometimes people aren't wearing masks. They're not really noticing the fact that this is very contagious. So it's like, what am I even doing this for? I've heard these kind of comments. So I just want to get some of your insight and wisdom on what you're thinking on how to deal with that, and if someone's watching this and trying to make those kind of tough decisions. Maybe give them some help here.
What's so great is that you really articulated that nuance, and it really shows how layered and at how many different levels that trauma can occur, and how uniquely individual it is. And so I think what you just highlighted, that what healthcare workers, going to work, certainly being exposed, having a duty, a strong calling, wanting to be there, but also then that sense of, gosh, what happens with my family? How do I navigate that so I don't expose my family? And I know lots of healthcare workers who have had to be separated from their families and from their young children, with fear of either exposing them or exposing their patients. So I think, to your point, it's us, our ability to talk about it. I think one of the first steps is to surface that as a really valid concern, and one that doesn't have an easy answer, but that can't just be easily dismissed. And so acknowledging their contribution and their duty and their calling and what they're doing for us as a nation to be serving day in and day out. And, it's not hyperbolic to say they're putting their lives at risk, and they're doing it willingly in the sense of their calling, but it is costing them. And so I think it's important for us to call that out, ensure that we're there to support them and not dismiss it. We owe them a debt of gratitude, and it can't go unspoken.
Yes.
And when we move on from this pandemic, we can't forget this. We can't forget the toll it's taken, particularly on our healthcare and other essential workers, but particularly our healthcare frontline workers. I'm really glad you raised that, because that's an important part of what we're all facing.
Thank you. Before we end, I want to give away a copy of your book. So what's the best, if we want to pre-purchase a copy of the book, how do we do it?
Well, it's available on Amazon. It's called Responsible, a Memoir.
Okay.
It's on Amazon both as a Kindle or ebook, readable on any device, or as a paperback.
Okay.
And you can order and send right from Amazon.
All right, good. I guess I was thinking about the something on December 1st or something like that, but we can go with that one. So Responsible, the memoir. I'd like to give away a copy of the book. The first one who answers, because we said this a couple of times during the interview, so I want to see if we're really paying attention. When was the event that happened to Dr. Hindle? When was that event? What year was that?
I know.
The first one to put it in the comments will win a copy of the book. And Joe, let's get Noelle a copy of the book as well.
No. I no matter what, will get a copy. I really look forward to reading that. You and I have gone through very similar situations, and listening to you, which many leaders, I'm sure, hearing this now, has been in your shoes in different types of trauma. But my gosh, listening to you talk is like hearing the same thoughts in my head. And it is empowering for others to hear messages like this, because this may be the key to help them get that help that they need. So thank you so much for everything you shared with us.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're so welcome.
Yeah.
I'm glad it came across that way.
These were like amazing pearls of wisdom.
Diana, she's just so calming. It's just like, I could just listen. She's just so soothing and calming when she talks. She just seems like she just never gets rattled about anything. There may not be reality, but it's just, that's the way you're coming across right now.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to be with you both. I mean, it's a great conversation. It's just easy, almost like we're in the same room. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I tell you, before COVID, I just didn't think of this kind of medium being this level of connection that we're able to have, and so it just amazes me how technology has progressed to that point. Kendra says, "Why cope when you can heal?" Yes, so that's something you said earlier, I guess.
Yep, that's the title of the second book.
Oh, there we go. Okay,
December 1st.
Okay, that's right.
Why cope when you can heal? And the idea that, of course, coping is good and resilience building is fantastic.
Yeah.
But to heal, we need to process.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Yeah, it's the second book. So.
Patty says October 16th, but I forgot what year. What is that? What is she talking about?
Oh, the date, because of the
date, the question that
the contest.
Okay.
What's interesting about that? Just the other day, of course, I'm fixated on the date. And for a long time, I had shorthand that was similar to 9/11. And of course, I never forget the date. It's always on my mind, or had, of course, been just ingrained. But it's interesting. I heard the date of another event that has struck us nationally a few years ago. And I thought, for everybody who was close to that event, they remember that date. It's seared. And for the rest of us, it is just another day. We don't, but similarly, 9/11 is something we hold in common as a date. When we say 9/11, we all know what we mean. And few of us really remember what we were doing on September 10th, but we all remember 9/11.
That is a good point. Yes, thank you. Okay, so here's what we'll do. So the first person who says, who gives me some advice they heard from Diane today, that person can win a copy of the book. How about that? We'll do that. And Dr. Stevenson, she says, Rollis, I have peers who quit because of the fear and continue to have nightmares. I will definitely read this book that I may share it with others. Wow, that's a good one. That's great feedback.
Thank you. I wrote it from my point of view, but I wrote it with the spirit that I hoped that it served as a voice for many people, that it would resonate with lots and lots of people. So I was hoping to channel what many of us feel when we've been through trauma.
Yeah. Well, I know we started a few minutes late. I'm sorry we kept you a few minutes past the 3:00 mark here, but I appreciate you staying with us today and hanging in there with us. It's been awesome.
Thank you.
What's the best way for folks to connect with you?
On LinkedIn.
Okay.
Diana Hindle.
All right.
DianaHendel. You can see it on my screen, actually.
Yep. We actually have you tagged in on this, so that they can click on you on. They can just click on you on LinkedIn if you want to do that.
Great. And I'm also very open to people contacting me through Gmail, and it's just Hindle Diana. So it's really simple, just last name, first name at Gmail. And so I welcome anyone to reach out that way as well.
Very good.
Yeah.
So, Joe, do you see a comment here that I can? It looks like I'm going to go with. I really appreciated what Ferris Stevenson did with her comments today. So I'm going to give her one of these here, virtual hugs from us to Dr. Stevenson, and she gets that book. She gets the book today.
Great.
And this is what I feel like. I feel like we've all done this today. We just we've bonded. It's been good. So thank you very much, Dr. Hindle. Thank you for who watched today. Hopefully you got some good wisdom out of this. And the thing that I would suggest to do is buy her book, the memoir. I think that would be a great thing to do, show our support and and definitely gained some gems of wisdom from that. So thank you for sharing your gems of wisdom with us today. Thank you for taking what was a horrible experience and turning it into a huge, huge positive that not only helped you, but also is helping all of us. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. I really appreciate being with both of you.
Diana.
All of you. Thank you.
So let's say bye to everybody. So bye, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
And then I'll ask you to do one pose for the editors for the thumbnail. Okay, we'll put in the first frame, right? A little smile. Oh, look. Ooh, we got Skylar.
Who heard you?
Hi there.
You
All
said
right.
bye, everybody. She goes, wait.
Yes, I love it. That's great.
Skylar.
This is a great picture. Awesome.
That's fabulous.
Can't top that one.
No.
Very good. Well, listen, have a great rest of the day. Again, it was great having you on. If you had a couple of minutes, you can stay on and I can talk to you afterwards. But if not, I
Sure.
totally understand if you have to go. Just
Oh.